I'm going to show you how to solve a proportion. First of all, a proportion is two equal ratios, basically two fractions that are equal to each other. So something like 3 over 4 equals 6 over 8. You have a proportion because the left side equals the right side. This is a ratio, that's a ratio. You've got two equal ratios. You have a proportion. Here's another proportion. 9 over 10 is 27 over 30. The left side equals the right side. You have a fraction here, a fraction here. You've got two ratios, two equal ratios. You have a proportion. Now, to solve a simple proportion like 3 over 4 equals who knows what over 8, to solve that, the easiest way to solve that is using the scale factor method. So basically this involves changing a fraction to higher terms or reducing a fraction to lower terms. And in this case we have 3 over 4 equals 1 over 8. Well, the scale factor here is 2 because 4 times 2 is 8 and 3 times 2 is 6. So question mark, the missing number is 6. Just that simple. See, we have another relatively easy proportion to solve. 11 over 40 is who knows what over 80. Well, this is raising a fraction to higher terms. How do we get from 40 to 80? We multiply by 2. The scale factor is 2. So we multiply the numerator by 2. 11 times 2 is 22. So our question mark is 22. So 11 over 40 is 22 over 80. So if you can use the scale factor method and it's a relatively easy problem, you should do so. However, on occasion, the problem might be slightly more difficult. So we'll use a simpler example to illustrate how we'd use the cross multiplication method to solve a proportion. So if we have 3 over 4 is goodness knows what over 8, instead of a question mark, we usually put in a variable, a letter. So we'll pick X. You can pick any letter you want. So you can pick A, B, C, D, E. We'll pick X. X, the unknown. So 3 over 4 equals X what over 8. The cross multiplication method goes like this. We start in the upper left-hand corner and go down to the lower right. We go 3 times 8 equals, well, the other two multiplied together. 4 times X. Now, here we have a simple one-step equation to solve. 24 equals 4 times what number? To solve that equation, we divide each side of the equation by 4. This is 4 times X. To solve a multiplication equation, we do the opposite operation, the inverse operation. We divide. So we divide each side by 4. 4 into 4 is 1. We have 1X. All we ever wanted. And 24 divided by 4 is 6. So 6 over 8 equals 3 over 4. And you can see why they call it cross multiplication, because when you do this, you get a big X in there. Looks like a big cross multiplication. For a simple problem like this, we probably wouldn't resort to cross multiplication. Probably just do the scale factor method. 4 times 2 is 8, 3 times 2 is 6. But this illustrates how we do the problem. Let's try another problem. So say we have 11 over 40 is question mark over 80. Well, we'll put a variable in because it's always so much better to have a variable than a question mark. And again, we cross multiply. We go 11 times 80 equals, well, the other two multiplied together. 40 times X. So now again, we have a simple one-step equation to solve. 40 times what number is 880. So I'll just do it in a slightly different color. So we divide each side by 40. So 40 into 40 is 1. I have 1X. is, let's see, I'll divide by 10. 488 is 22. So x must be 22. So 22 over 80 is 11 over 40. Now it does not make any difference where the unknown quantity is. When you cross multiply, you will always get a one-step multiplication equation to solve. The x may be on this side, it may be on that side. Whatever side it's on, whatever is being multiplied by it, you divide by it, and you will solve the proportion very quickly. Now, I wonder why cross multiplication works the way it does. So let's give a simple example here. Say we know that 3 over 4 equals 6 over 8. It's a proportion, two equal ratios, and I know it's true. Now I can multiply each side of the equation by anything I'd like, so long as I do the same thing to both sides of the equation to maintain the equality. So I'm going to multiply each side by 8. So here we go. I multiply the right side by 8, and multiply the left side by 8. Why did I pick 8? Because that's that denominator right there. And then I'm going to multiply each side by 4. I multiply each side by 4. Now when I do that, 8's cancel out here, the 4's cancel out here, and I'm left with 8 times 3 equals 6 times 4. Let's figure right there, right? 6 times 4. Now, that's what we got when we cross-multiplied. If I cross-multiplied this, I'd be going 3 times 8 is 6 times 4. So that's why the cross multiplication works the way it does, because you can multiply each side of the equation by the denominator of each of the ratios and get rid of them that way and make something that has no denominator to it, something that can be easily solved. So wherever the missing number is, you can solve that equation. So if the missing number were here, if this were x, well, what would I have? That would, instead of, it would be an x here. So 8 times x would equal 6 times 4. I'd divide each side by 8, and I'd have x is, hope it's 3. 3 times 8 is 24. So it doesn't make any difference where the x is. If you cross multiply, you can solve it in one step after you cross multiply. So let's review quickly. How to solve a proportion. Part 1. What is a proportion? Two equal ratios. Here's a couple typical proportions. We can use the scale factor method. It's a pretty good method. And if it's a relatively simple problem, you might as well do a relatively simple way of solving it and find out, multiply by 2, pretty simple, and find the answer that way. Same thing here. It's easy to use the scale factor method, so we do. We multiply by 2 and pretty much instantly find the answer. Now, the cross multiplication method, I'm using simple examples, but when you have a far more complex proportion to solve, cross multiplication is the way to go. So here, how do I do it again? I always start in the upper left and go to the lower right. 3 times 8. Then I multiply the other two, 4 times x. Whatever number is in front of x, I divide each side by it, and I have my answer. So I cross multiply, I divide, answer. Works every single time. Same thing here, same procedure. Upper left to lower right, 11 times 80 is 880. Multiply the other two, 40 times x is 40 times x. Divide each side by 40. X is equal to 22. Simple way of doing it, and everybody on our planet does it this way. If it's a relatively complex problem, you should do it this way also. And finally, why it works. Looks a little messy, doesn't it? It works because you can get rid of the denominators. You can multiply each side by 8, you can multiply each side by 4. When you do, the 8's cancel out here, you're left with 6 times 4. The 4's cancel out here, you're left with 8 times 3. That's why the cross multiplication works. You don't actually have to know why it works to use it, but it's an interesting bit of knowledge to possess. So I say to you, this is how we solve simple proportions. Happy computing.